The context of this video is to discuss body composition in relation to the production of energy in relation to athletic performance. In no way is this video made to shame anyone's body image. To be very clear, this is a sports science video in relation to body fat and energy production. So first of all, I need to address the controversy. I did state in my previous video a strong dislike for carrot cake. In my defense, I was extremely upset when I made that video as a proud Englishman and combat sports fan as to what happened in the boxing. I therefore am now willing to accept carrot cake if it's given with love, but not hyphy mud. Never hyphy mud.
No disrespect, champ. But he jokes about it himself. That dude needs to stay exactly how he is. See, look, he's got muscles under there. Like, look at his stomach.
And Joe Rogan discussed this on his podcast, and he discussed it from a slightly different angle in terms of the actual cushion that it can give fighters when they're absorbing shots to the body.
He's just got some body fat on him. But here's one thing. If you do have great cardio, one thing that body fat can do is it can protect you somewhat. It's like wearing 8 sweaters. I've joked around about this before. And then if you hit him to the body and he barely reacts, you'd be like, F***.
And so after the Ruiz-Joshua fight, there's a lot of talk in media and social media as to how does someone that looks like Ruiz beat someone that looks like Joshua. Now, in my mind, combat sports fans and athletes will understand that in the heavyweight division, one punch can change everything. People will understand that despite the way he looks, that Ruiz is an elite fighter. He is a trained fighter. Now, there's a different discussion in relation to his skill level versus Joshua. In terms of just looking at their body images and saying, how could this guy win? I think that combat sports fans understand that that's not really the right discussion point. However, it is something that the media picked up on. And indeed, the BBC had an article titled... And so to be very clear, there's a distinction here. This video is about elite athletes, not about members of the general public. When I'm talking about his body composition, this is specific to his sport, not for the regular person. And absolutely, having large amounts of visceral fat is not healthy for you. And so the discussion is, well, is his body composition, carrying large amounts of body fat, actually beneficial for him when he's fighting? And of course, I cannot give you an exact answer, and I'll explain why. It's a nuanced topic. It heavily depends on the fighter, their coaches, their game plan, the style of the fight, their specific skill set and attributes. There's so much involved. But what I can do is use this as an in to discuss energy systems without boring you into an afternoon's sleep. I have wanted to discuss energy systems for a long time, so I'm going to very briefly explain 3 energy systems and how they relate to boxing. And what you can then do is then apply it to this question in terms of, is this fat helping him in his fights? You can also apply it to your regular training outside of sport. And so as with everything I do on this channel, I want to give you information and you apply it to the correct context in your scenarios. And so you can think of energy systems as kicking in depending on the activity. First, we have the anaerobic energy system without oxygen, which is called the ATP-PC system. And essentially, this is your most explosive, powerful work. For example, the power punching, the left hook knockout punch, or a combination of power punches ending a fight. Now, it can be hard to give an exact time frame on how long this lasts because research varies, but around 10 seconds of maximal work where your body produces energy for this short, high power output activity. Through some ATP stores, it has some energy stored in the body, but it's a finite amount which can't last that long, just a few seconds, but also through the breakdown of creatine phosphate. And so this system can also be known as the phosphagen system. Creatine phosphate is broken down to produce ATP, and this gives you energy for these short, explosive, maximal bursts, for example, power punching in boxing. And so another distinction we have to make instantly when we look at this is the heavyweight division. It's very different to lighter weight divisions in terms of its characteristics. These are large men, powerful men. They have one-punch knockout power. The actual fighting styles are very different to what you see at lighter weights. For example, agility, footwork, punching speed can be faster in the lighter weight classes, whereas punching power can be larger in the larger weight classes such as heavyweight. And so that is one distinction to make first of all. But what is consistent amongst all weight classes really is that fighters want to be as big as possible for their weight class. They want to maintain their power in a fight after they've been weight cutting and training for the fight. And so this relates not just to body fat, but muscle mass. How much body fat should you be carrying as a fighter? How much muscle mass should you be carrying? These are interesting questions, and they do relate to energy systems in part, as well as other things such as muscle fibers. And in boxing, you are using a mixture of energy systems. You are using aerobic energy systems, which involves the uptake and the use of oxygen, and anaerobic energy systems, which is the absence of oxygen, when you are producing energy without oxygen. All energy systems involve the production of ATP. ATP is the body's energy currency. You need ATP for energy to perform movements. However, all the energy systems is they are producing ATP in different ways due to the specific nature of what you are doing. The more powerful, explosive activities such as power punching, you're not able to intake oxygen effectively. Therefore, you have to produce ATP in different ways to the more aerobic, longer lasting, more endurance-based activities where you are able to consistently use oxygen and produce more ATP for longer. And so there are a lot of reaction channels on YouTube where people just play someone else's content and sit there watching it. And that can be very popular for some unknown reason. I'm going to dip my foot into that water. Here was my authentic reaction to the Ruiz-Joshua fight.
Almost landing in right hands from Ruiz, and now a barrage. The champ's in trouble, and down he goes.
Are you not entertained? And so instantly, one of the negatives of carrying more body fat is that you have more of an energy requirement to fulfill your mass. For Ruiz, when he's fighting in the ring, carrying such large amounts of weight, you need to be burning more calories to operate that mass. And the same can be said with someone who's highly muscled. So the larger you are, the more calorie expenditure is needed, and there will be. And therefore, nutrition is very important because you need to fuel your body for the fuel systems you will use in your sport. And a simple application is the more power punches someone may throw, they may fatigue quicker. These larger men have to be more selective with their power punches because if they're throwing them constantly, they're going to fatigue quicker with that large amount of mass they're carrying over the many rounds that they have to fight. And that's why some larger fighters tend to gas later on in fights if they have a very explosive style. And so as a very general introduction, lower intensity activities require more fat for fuel than glucose. Essentially, our body uses fatty acids, fat, and carbohydrates, glucose as fuel sources. Now, of course, this will vary, of course, depending on the specific activity and, of course, the specific diet of the person. However, generally speaking, lower intensity activities will use more fat for fuel, not just fat for fuel. They will use a mixture of fuels, but more fat, and higher intensity activity and work will use more glucose. And so when you think about boxing and you think about power punching, instantly you can relate that to the need to uptake glucose before your fight to fuel your body for those aspects of the fight. And so what makes boxing so hard to train for in many ways is that you're using all three energy systems within a boxing fight. As opposed to, for example, a 100-meter sprint, where it's very clear the elite athletes are sprinting for 10 seconds. They're using the anaerobic ATP-PC system. That's easy for me to say. And diverting slightly, one of the reasons that MMA is so hard to train for is not just the multiple skill sets that these incredible athletes have to train. It's also they're using all three energy systems, and so sporadically, and you cannot accurately and objectify the energy systems. You cannot say in an MMA fight or a boxing fight, you're going to use this energy system for this amount of time, this energy system for this amount of time, because all fights are different. The styles of fights, the way that fights play out are all different. And so these fighters are having to train multiple energy systems and multiple skills, as well as their strength and conditioning and their game planning and their nutrition. And this is why I have so much respect for combat athletes. And as a divergence, for example, I'm not a big fan of celebrities having fights for some sort of beef. I know that Kenny Photoshop has just challenged Dingleberry to a fight. Even if these things are for charity, when they're not for charity, they're for ego. I'm not a fan of non-trained fighters fighting. There are other ways that people can overcome their disputes with each other. There are other ways that people can raise money for charity rather than throwing punches at each other's heads. And as someone who respects the art form and respects combat fighters so much, I'm not a fan of non-trained fighters performing in these exhibitions. And so boxers have to develop aerobic and anaerobic capacity, improve these attributes to perform better in their sport. And Ruiz will be doing this. This is something I need to state. Ruiz is a trained fighter. He will be training his skill set. He will be training energy systems, strength and conditioning, his sparring also, which is specifically working on the energy systems needed in his sport. Ruiz is a trained fighter. The reason he has this body composition is due to his nutrition. He will be burning a hell of a lot of calories in his training. But it's through his nutrition and his calorie surplus that he's building this large body fat. But absolutely, he will have strength. He will have developed muscle hypertrophy. He will have increased his muscle size. That old phrase, there is muscle under there, will hold true with him. And then we have the glycolytic system, the anaerobic glycolytic system. And if you like, this is the mid-range. The ATP-PC system is the most explosive activity. We then have the aerobic, longest enduring activity, that energy system that I'll get to. And then if you like, you can think of the glycolytic system as being in the middle. And so you can think of this as moderate power, short duration activities. And essentially all this is the breakdown of glucose into energy and lactic acid. And I could make this more complicated by talking about slow and fast glycolysis, but don't want to do that. Essentially, just think of it as the mid-range energy systems. And again, it's problematic to put an exact time frame on it, but around 2 to 3 minutes of moderate intensity work will kick in the anaerobic glycolytic system. And you can relate this to boxing, moving around the ring, throwing jabs, throwing different combinations, but not those short 1 to 10 second bursts of trying to finish someone. And so you can think about in boxing and mixed martial arts how perhaps a few minutes of moderate to higher intensity work will involve this energy system. The breakdown of glucose to produce energy. Again, instantly, now you can think about how intaking glucose, carbohydrates, is important for athletes who participate in these moderate to higher intensity sports. And then we have the oxidative system. This is aerobic, this is low power, long duration, lots of energy produced when we have oxygen. And yes, part of this system will be used in boxing over 12 rounds. You are going to have that stamina. And when you think of boxing, you think of the Rocky films. You may think of the Rocky films. You may actually follow boxing, and you'll know that road work, running and jogging is a sort of staple of the boxer's training. And you may say, well, how does this relate? Well, of course, they do want to be efficient at using oxygen. They do want to increase their aerobic capacity for a fight, for a 10 or 12 round fight. And one application of boxing is actually recovery. Between rounds, they want to be able to get the oxygen back into the body. They want to recover faster. And so absolutely training that oxidative system is one part and one energy system that boxers will train. And there are different ways that energy can be produced using the aerobic system, involving the Krebs cycle and other methods. But essentially, it's breaking down fatty acids and some glucose to produce energy. Now, this can be slower to break down and produce, but you're going to have a longer, larger amount of energy over time. And so when you think of this question, well, does fat win you fights? Again, it's slightly condescending to Ruiz because he's a trained fighter. He's an elite fighter. In many people's opinions, many experts in boxing, he's not of the skill level and competence of Joshua. So from that aspect, it was a surprise. But if you're looking purely at body composition and fat, we can't be so black and white in this. He's a trained fighter. He will have been training these different energy systems. But the BBC article says if you maintain more mass, you can have more power, but then it detracts from the agility. So again, there's pros and cons to it. For someone like him maintaining large amounts of fat, perhaps there's pros and cons. The pros, perhaps it gives you a form of a shield. It can allow you, your more mass can allow you to have more power. If you are fit, i.e. if you have been training the energy systems and you are conditioned for your fight, then it can be beneficial. But of course, you have to weigh up the disadvantages. So again, I don't have the answer. This is something to put out to people who know more than me about boxing, but also I think it's a very useful application to what energy systems are and how they can relate to sports, and you should be able to relate them to your work in the gym. Now, this of course will depend on the athlete, their coaches, their game plan, the characteristics, the type of fight they're expecting. There are a lot of things involved. However, it's slightly condescending just to look at someone like Ruiz and say, well, he cannot win this fight because he looks like that. That's kind of silly. Should he be carrying that much body fat? My personal opinion is no, he does not need to be carrying that much body fat. But again, I'm not an expert in combat sports by any stretch of the imagination. Clearly, judging by my beautiful intact face, that was a joke. I don't think I've got a beautiful intact face. And so please let me know what you think. I think this is a very, very interesting topic. And so I'm James Linker. This is Shredded Sports Science.
I'll see you soon.